Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. So I'm already at a slight disadvantage because I don't know where I'm supposed to put this. I don't have pockets, and I have notes. I don't know if this will hang here.
I'm an HR guy, so ask someone else.
He told me to hold it. No hashtags for you.
When you get up and just set it on the seat behind
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so first obstacle handled. Second is maybe these will work. So, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And before I begin, I do want to thank friends and families and colleagues who I invited, and not to hear me, but to make me come. I had agreed to do this like September. And I had agreed under the gentle nudging of Bill Graustein. I was visiting with him and he said, oh, you know, you tell great stories. Do you know about? And I was like, yeah. Well, you should tell a story. And I thought, no way. But if you know Bill, he usually has pretty good suggestions. So I thought, maybe I will. And I came a few times and saw it was a gentle, friendly audience. So I thought I'd give it a try. So I am happy and nervous to be here tonight. So Kevin introduced me as Denise Manning Keys Page. I don't generally introduce myself with all of those names. But as this is a story of place and legacy, and those are the names that connect me to both. So for tonight, I'm all of those names. Usually I'm just Denise. So I do also want to share that I do have the pleasure of being a CLP alum. I was a co-facilitator with Bill for cohorts 2 and 3, and I know how essential story is to the work of CLP, and I know how important it is to building of community. So given that, it's really the reason that I accepted this challenge. So I have notes because you probably don't know, but I'm over 35. So what I want to share with you tonight is a story of my mother. It's a childhood story of my mother, and I don't know many of her childhood stories. She didn't tell many, nor were many told about her from others. And when I finish this story tonight, maybe you'll have an understanding of why that's so. I'm choosing to tell the story in the first person, in her voice, in the voice of Dorothy, the way I heard it. So as I'm telling it, when I speak of mother and daughter, it's not me, Denise, and Dorothy. It's Dorothy, daughter, and Grace, her mother. So it was 1927, and I was about 7 years old. It was shortly after my father had died of tuberculosis. And I remember lying in a sparse room with the only light coming from the flickering gas light from the street lamps below me. In the same room, across from me a few feet, lay my mother, in a cot also tightly tucked in. Or maybe it was a hospital bed. I don't really remember, I realize. But I do remember that I lie there listening for whimpers from my recently widowed mother, whimpers that really weren't forthcoming. And I was also listening for the rhythmic rumbling of Midnight Mariah. Midnight Mariah was one of the few constants in my young life. She was the train that came through New Haven every Saturday night at midnight. She wasn't really called Midnight Mariah. That's what I named her. I would lie there waiting for midnight, really only fear and a daughterly love keeping me awake, listening for her sounds. And then I would hear and the rumbling and the trembling, and I would rock just ever so slightly side by side in my bed. And her one eye would illuminate the whole room, and in that moment of light, I would steal a glance at my mother lying not far from me. When Midnight Mariah made her exit and tooted her horn just as she left New Haven, taking the light and the sound with her, I would wait a few moments, and then I'd ask, Mommy, Mommy, did you hear her? Did you hear Mariah blow her horn? After what seemed like an interminable silence, my mother would whisper, "Yes, Dorothy. Yes, I heard old Mariah blow her horn. Now get some sleep now, dear. You need your rest for Sunday school tomorrow." Relieved that God had spared me and my baby sister Edwina at least one more night from being orphans, I would obediently go off to sleep. And when I slept, most nights, I would dream of a place where the hills swelled with Queen Anne's lace and blueberries as it made its way down to the Connecticut River. It was the place where my Uncle John lived, where my parents and I, when they were healthy, and my baby sister Edwina, and my two younger teenage sisters, Mabel and Edna, would spend our summers with family there. And on weekends, too, when my father's schedule would allow it. Uncle John's house was in Deep River on a plateau. It was a big Victorian house filled with porcelain vases and comfortable down coverlets. It had all the abundance of love and poetry and learning and laughter that my house had had before illness crept in and robbed us of it. So as I lay in this now barren room, I got great comfort in thinking of the home in Deep River, the home where abundance and love and laughter still resided. In our home, before illness had come, before tuberculosis and cancer had made its arrival into our family, our home too had been filled with laughter and love and learning and an abundance of food and books. Oh my God, my mother loved books. Our house was filled with books. And art. The art was my dad's. My dad had attended Yale Art School from 1913 to 1915, and his work was all throughout the house. To support himself, however, like most people with fine arts degrees, he had to do something practical. Like he was a sign painter with a studio on State Street. I had the pleasure of attending that studio many years with him in the 20s, helping, I think, him get his signs out. So as I lay there with my mother in this barren room, conjuring up the memories of Deep River really helped to give me comfort in the present and hope for the future. But alas, the visits did stop. My mother did ultimately succumb to breast cancer. And when she did, we were fortunate, Edwina and I, in that a family took us in, a foster family, and we stayed with them until the age of majority, and we had plenty of everything there. But one thing had changed. We had been Yale kids, and then, like today, there has always been a certain panache to that. But one thing that's different, in 1927, being a ward of the state carried a stigma. And I learned to live with that stigma, holding on to the lessons and the memories of my parents when they were with me. When I was in my father's studio, he would talk about the importance of education. In fact, he had a saying, and his saying was, "You know, Dorothy, not everybody can get a college education, but it's a darn fool who doesn't get all the free education that's available to us." Those words lived within me. In fact, my father, when he knew he was ill, he had managed to squirrel away some money that the state, wouldn't be able to take. And that money was for Edwina and I to go to college. In 1936, I did attend with that money. I began to attend New Haven Teachers College. And it wasn't quite enough to go to college, so I supplemented my income by being a weekend domestic and seamstress to a family that lived on East Rock Road. Well, I didn't mind the work one bit, but what I did mind is that they seemed to be perfectly comfortable airing their dirty laundry in front of me. In fact, sometimes I felt like they waited for me to come so that the missus, when she was drunk, which was often, would choose those times to tell me even the most intimate details about her husband. And her husband, when he was in his cups, which was most nights after work, he would leer at me in a way that made me feel threatened and unsafe. So I knew that I needed to find another position, a position that would supplement my college schedule, but a place that I could work with dignity and a feeling of safety. So one day in 1936, while I'm on this job searching haunt, I was walking down Ashman Street, not the Ashman Street we all know, the Ashman Street before the high-rise apartments which were built in 1952 that are now gone. This was the Ashman Street of 1936. And I passed by a dry cleaner's window where there was a sign advertising a presser. I walked in, and the kindly-eyed, whiskered white man behind the counter, with only a bit of a hesitation, handed me an application when I asked for it. I filled out the application and handed it to him. He mumbled something. I turned and began to exit. As I approached the door to exit, I felt and then heard the slight rumbling of a passing train. It stirred something within me. Then, in a few moments, I heard the low roar and whistle of the train. It stopped me. I turned around and faced the kindly, gentle, whiskered man behind the counter who had his back to me as he was proceeding to the back of the dry cleaners to continue his work. "Excuse me, sir," I said. He turned around. I was glad to see he still had the application in his hand. It hadn't yet made the trash can. He turned. I felt a bit of confidence when he looked at me that I didn't know I had, and I twirled around. I twirled because I had on a lovely skirt that I made that was accordion pleated. And I said to him, "Sir, I made this skirt myself. I pressed the pleats into the fabric myself. I really can sew and press." He looked down at the application for the first time. "Dorothy Manning," he said. "Yes." "Why, I knew a fine colored gentleman by the name of Edwin Manning. Any kin of yours?" "My dad," she whispered. "Why, you sound something like him. You have the same voice tone and the same kind of well-chosen words you had. Folks tell me he was a Yalie." I knew not to respond to the latter part of that. "Yes, people have told me that I sound like my dad," I chose to say. "Why, I bought this house from Mr. Edwin Manning." I stood in the place of my childhood, aware for the first time that I was standing in the parlor of my childhood home, and that above me was the room in which I had lain, waiting to hear Midnight Mariah rumble by, so I would have the assurance of my mother's still breathing, where I would lay waiting for my mother to hear the whispers of life from my mother. "When can you begin?" he asked me. And so, in 1936, I began working in the stifling heat in the back of the dry cleaners, in the room that had been the kitchen of my childhood, the kitchen that had been bountiful with love and laughter and food and books and art and learning, the room where I now hid because, folk may not understand why I hired you. You understand. And so I hid there and remembered the stories shared, the Bible readings and the readings from the Child's Garden of Verses, and the good times listening to Scott Joplin I learned later. And I was grateful. And I would be in the back kitchen, and I'd think, even from the grave, Daddy, even from the grave, you and the memories of Midnight Mariah saw that I got all the education I could. Right away? Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So you want to take some questions?
I will.
Okay, anyone have any questions? Are we back to Denise, or you still Denise?
I'm Denise. Yes.
Where did you grow up in New Haven?
I started out on Admiral Street, and then Kensington Street, and then I got kidnapped to Milford.
I recognize, at least there's some recognition of the name Manning, but I don't know where I know.
Yeah, well, there is another, that name, at least on our side of the family, died with us. They were a family of women, but all of the children, under pain of death, we have to name our children with Manning as a middle name. I think we have some in the room, right? some Manning cousins in the room. And then I know that there's Ron and Delilah Manning, who you might,
Dr. Manning, it seemed like it was a doctor Manning.
yeah, not, to my knowledge, not a relation. Mm-mm. Yeah, could be, yeah, not to my knowledge. The house in this story was actually owned by my great-grandfather, according to the 1860 census. So the house where my mother ended up working in the dry cleaners had been owned first by her grandfather and then her father in 1860 in New Haven.
Is that across the street from Webster?
I would not know. It was 1927.
My mother was born up right on that corner there by, she told me about her drive.
Yeah, I really would. It was 1936 when my mother worked there, and my first awareness of Ashman Street is when the high-rise projects were built in 1952. So I don't know.
Like the church up there, St. Paul, it was down on the corner of Webster and it moved up there.
Well, see the power of stories? So now we know more. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yep.
I have two. So one is, why did you choose to tell the story in the I?
Mm-hmm.
And then what has that done for you and your relationship to your mother?
The story itself? Yeah, so I chose to tell it in the I because my mother spoke beautifully. I have no other word. My mother was known for it. She was very succinct, and when she spoke, you understood what she was saying, so I thought I'll use her words really in tribute to her. Again, as I said, I had very few stories about her. I think her life after 1927 was not threatening, but painful. She had lost 3 family members by 1927. And I've always joked that her story started again in 1939 when she met my dad. So, so that's what it meant. It gave me a piece of her. And I can remember as a kid aching, thinking of her lying in this room, waiting for the train because she had nagged her mother so many times. Mom, are you still alive? But that's what she was really asking. So yeah, so it really helped me to understand some of what it must have been like. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I just want to thank you for a beautiful story, wonderfully told.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure, and thanks for the support. You're welcome.